everybody ready and stuff?
I believe so.
Cool.
Cool. 177. Oh, no, Taylor, please don't do this to me. All right, I'm good.
All right, is everybody ready? All right, let's begin. Observation 1 is going to be framework 1 is that the affirmative has the right to define a resolution through the use of parametrics in order to prove it true, and is then the opposition's refutation must negate the abs proof of the resolution in order to win today's ballot. Second is that since we are going to be evaluating this through a lens of a policymaker, therefore we're going to be evaluating through all-inclusive net benefits. This allows us to weigh the implications of case versus implications of dissent or criticisms. Third is that all terms are defined contextually as long as it's not shown to exclude the negative in any sort of fashion and should be accepted. The background is that Native Americans are treated unfairly in the status quo when it comes to any sort of districting or representation within. This is going to be very important for particularly the scattered regions all throughout the United States for them to be able to have any sort of voice. Therefore, the context is that the United States federal government should mandate that all redistricting plans in the U.S. be done by the National Congress of American Indians. Again, the United States federal government should mandate that all redistricting plans in the United States be done by the National Congress of American Indians. Solvency is one. This is an inclusive group that the leaders often change between different organizations within the National Congress of American Indians. So it's shown to be one inclusive of all groups within the who identify themselves as Native Americans in the United States. And second, this allows them to be able to redistrict themselves to be able to have sort of representation within their collective home state or area where they reside, which allows them to, one, to be able to have people who actually represents their best interests, and second, to be able to also to be able to fairly adjudicate the rest of the districts. Moving on to Advantage 1, disenfranchisement. A is for uniqueness. Voting districts hurt minorities now. Ever since the 69 Allen v. State Board of Elections ruling, it particularly has hurt people of color as well as Native Americans. Second is that districts hurt to the poor now. Many gerrymandered districts diffuse the power of low income votes by splitting them into many districts according to the Atlantic. 3 is that voting efficacy is increasing now, but it's fragile. According to a study done by the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, voter efficacy has increased since 2013, but has remained fragile because people, one, they don't necessarily think their vote can matter, and second is because they're, like, even then, they might belong to a district that might be opposite to what they believe in, particularly within Native American regions where their voices are split up and not fairly represented in their state or in the federal government. The link is that the plan passes and previously unfairly structured districts are repaired. Second, when voting districts are fair, voting efficacy increases the same as from the same study of the University of Tennessee, Knoxville shows that more representative districts have higher levels of turnout, especially prevalent in districts that had previously no representations. 3 is high levels of political efficacy increase voter turnout. When voters feel like their vote matters, they will go out to the poll and make that and do the research and elect the candidate that they feel best represents them. And instead of feeling like your vote doesn't matter because you're a Democrat in a mostly Republican area, or like say you're a Native American like in a Republican area, this allows you to be able to have the voice and to be able to elect people who you want. The impacts is voter disenfranchisement. We're able to at least resolve some of the fragments left from voter disenfranchisement. Voter disenfranchisement has been called the last drafts of the Jim Crow laws, and this allows us to begin the first steps. So now it's not like we're going to solve the entirety of the situation, but at least beginning the first steps for adequate representations of people we commonly do not think of when we make policies. Probably people who we commonly ignore when it comes to policy making. And civil engagement is key because it allows for people to be able to engage within their government. When they come out and vote and give and participate within the government, this allows them to be, one, to be able to feel like they are a part of something, and second, allows them to make any sort of changes and feel like they can their vote can usher in the changes necessary to their particular region. Advantage 2, brinksmanship. A is for uniqueness. Political brinksmanship is high now, with near constant broad budget crises have allowed for the Republican Party to take the federal government hostage yearly. Second is that Republican control of the House is because of the gerrymandering, which is unfair to because electoral districts allow for the continuously reshaping of it, and when they have when gerrymandering occurs, this allows for areas that were predominantly Democrats to become predominantly Republican because of how districts are shaped. The link is that plan passes and it is reformed, and this allows for current districts to be able to reform and to be able to allow for more adequate representations. The impacts here is going to be surprisingly forced. So when a government shutdown occurs, most of them have prolonged wages, and most government employees, they are able to at least sustain themselves for quite a bit when there is a government shutdown or in the talks of a government shutdown. However, when you do have government shutdowns, one of the main people that gets affected is the National Forest Service employees. Now these people do a lot, even though they are in probably one of the most rural areas. Like, they do things from preventing wildfires, because we know Smokey the Bear does not prevent wildfires as much as we'd like to believe. These people are on the front of the lines and allow for one to be able to at least track any sort of environmental conditions that would allow for wildfires, as well as to be able to contain these wildfires and not allow to expand. And this is going to be important because without these National Forest Service employees, that usually when government shutdowns occurs, they lose their jobs, they lose their wages. Like, there's no one mending these national parks, as we saw the last government shutdown, when many national parks like Zion was ultimately shut down because there's no one to maintain it, there's no one to be able to take care of it. This, without any sort of containment of things like fire, we see excess amounts of CO2 in the air, we see poor air quality, which we see what happened in the summer, all over California. There are wildfires, and that caused people with respiratory issues, particularly young children and older adults, to have these issues. And when we're able to at least prevent these sorts of circumstances where we would have government shutdowns or imminent government shutdowns, if we're able to at least prevent that from power struggle from occurring in the first place, we're able to prevent these impacts from occurring. So for these reasons, you support.
Starting with Justin.
Yours is going to be one off, in case.
Is it a criticism?
It is. Sweet. There's also a big solvency dump on the top of the case, so I don't know. I would suggest filling it on a separate page.
I'm just gonna put it next to solvency.
All right. I mean, you, but just letting you know there's going to be a lot of input.
Cool.
All right. Is anyone not ready? First off is criticism. The ACE opponent's framework. The first argument is that the rule about is to interrogate the ontological foundations of sovereign power. Again, the rule about is to interrogate the ontological foundations of sovereign power. The second argument is that ontological assumptions are the basis of all sovereign policymakers and decision making. So we have to understand who we are and how we came to be and what we believe things to be before we can actually understand how we ought to interact with the world and make decisions. The third argument is that debate is always going to be a question of values. Insofar as you're the judge, and you have to determine whether or not the affirmative was more desirable, the negative was more desirable. You're always going to be establishing what is a desirable way of existence or a desirable ontology. The B subpoint is the links. The first link is that of rights. The creation of rights by the affirmative as a construct that requires a state in the population makes rights contingent on state participation. Political participation just seeks to make individuals more subservient to the sovereign, and attempts to make sovereign subservience look benevolent in the face of politics. The second argument is that of inclusion. The affirmative is a defensive including population that creates boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable forms of political engagement or like life in general. This form of inclusive exclusion, they focus on those who have been gerrymandered by policymakers in the past, but what they're doing in regards to the affirmative is they're taking these people that have been included and putting them in the political spotlight, saying, hey, congratulations, you can participate in politics now. Good for you, you're now a form of acceptable life as opposed to one that we previously rejected. The third argument is that of threat construction. The one who sees depiction of suffering of individuals, specifically when we're talking about people who haven't been represented or not participating in the political process, is simply one used to justify the state of emergency that focuses the political process on one that will support the life of the sovereign. They indicate that the only political process. The only reason that we ought to have people included into the sphere of politics is because it allows for like a purer form of sovereignty and a purer form of democracy that just sustains the existence of the state. The fourth argument is that this strategy represents the methodological fluidity of legality, which allows the sovereign to flip-flop its position. It allows the state to essentially create the state of exception. Whenever we look back historically, when the Black Panthers stormed the Capitol building in California, they did so legally as indicated by the state constitution, but whenever the state government figured out that they didn't like the Black Panthers being there, they just amended the constitution to make their act illegal and then prosecuted them for it. The CISA points the impacts. The first is it's the root cause of all your impacts. Whenever they seek out life, defining it, and attempting to control it, what they're doing is they're creating divisions of acceptable or unacceptable forms of life. This is the root cause of all This methodology allows for the violent management of life to become justified because they indicate that there are certain people that have the protection of the sovereign while other forms of unacceptable life are justified in their violent extermination. The second argument is that of aimless atrocities. The affirmative just secures securing the existence of the sovereign, fuses the safety with political, it fuses the safety with the political, which is the foundation of biopower, in which all living beings become the living dead or bare life. Their form of trying to secure the political existence of different individuals makes the state the arbiter of security and our safety and our life, which is, like I said, the foundation of biopower. The third argument is error replication. The false divisions of living and dead produces a normative subject of law and a zone of distinction between which when the Musliman can arise, which is the symbolic, represents the symbolic annihilation of meaning or value. The policy reform becomes impossible within the world of the affirmative because all actions taken by the state are only used to relegate the subject to the periphery or the sovereign. The D subpoint is the alternative. The alt text is to vote negative to endorse whatever being. Vote negative to endorse whatever being. The first solvency argument is that the sovereign grounds its existence in a series of contingent histories that allows for a politicalization of bare life. Whatever being refers to a life that cannot be reduced to those determinations. It's a preference to not engage in the categorization or determinations of the state. The second argument is that the alt is the only way to solve the aft. The alt's refusal to obey the norms of codified life reconciles the difference by refusing to externalize and compartmentalize our existence. And the third argument is that the perm is the worst form of paranoid exceptionalism that further articulates the state of emergency, which demands that the alt cede to the demands of the state in order to maintain the existence of the sovereign. Now, in the case first solvency, the first turn is that of ideology. The ace opponents that PMC is only a tool that serves to entrench neoliberal capital. They redistrict with the idea that some type of involvement with democracy is good, while ignoring the fact that global capital trends towards repression of rights. The beast opponents that ethics become impossible under systems of capital because capitalism is an economic system that thrives and exists based off of ascribing value to certain ideas, objects, and actions. Then we can never actually posit the correct ethical answer to ethical questions whenever we deliberate because the only answer that we can posit is one that has been informed by capitalist values. The second turn is that of information management. The ace point is that legislation to redistrict is part of a broader matrix of legality used as a tool of the sovereign to influence which and how populations react to the state and its actions. The ace point is that this leads to all forms of violence because it allows the state to suddenly, what's that word?
Yeah.
Sure. The B point is that it leads to all forms of violence because it allows the state to suddenly deem individuals as dangerous and because they pose a threat to the existence of like the democratic state. The third term is that of futurism. The ace point is that the affirmative is a politic of foresight that asserts that we care about the future because
Future lives.
because of future lives, we ought to like create the political space is more benevolent in order to improve the standard of living for the people in the future. The beast point is that this results in the manifestation of violence against the queer body. Actually, I don't know if I want this term. Okay. The fourth term that of fantasy, the ace point is that the affirmative creates enemies in situations they find aesthetically displeasing, i.e. the politicians that gerrymander so hard to satisfy their desire to become the psychic savior. The beast point is that violence is created by the psychic desires to resolve violence with certainty. This locks into place the violent and repetitive forms of politics that always seek out different individuals to identify as enemies and to exert violence on them. The fifth argument is that the act doesn't have any solvency because neutral third parties aren't going to stay neutral for long because political groups, mainly conservative lobbyists, are always going to try to influence these neutral third parties until they aren't neutral anymore. All political parties have an agenda, and they're going to be influenced by like monetary interests, which means that this third party isn't going to stay neutral for very long, and it's not going to solve the act. The sixth argument is a minority term. And whenever we looked at the fact that Chicago was recently or like historically redistricted to give minorities representations because they specifically identify different communities and give them like voting blocks, the plan removes these districts that give actual minorities representation in the status quo. The seventh argument is that there's no solvency because the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder indicates that states don't need federal approval to redistrict themselves, which means that whenever the National Congress of American Indians redistricts the United States, then states, if they don't like the way that the districts were redrawn, are just going to redraw them again. The next argument is the Indians' rhetoric term. The ace of point is that the use of the affirmative colonial language to describe the indigenous first peoples of the North America is a form of colonial language that was originally used by Christopher Columbus in the misidentification of the first peoples. The B sub point is that this racist or the colonial history that indigenous first peoples have faced, because whenever we identify them as Indians, that doesn't actually grant them any form of sovereignty or autonomy, because we are indicating that their self-identification or their cultural history isn't important, but rather the misidentification that happened 600 years ago is a better way to reference them. The ninth argument is the Native Americans rhetoric term. The ace of point is that whenever we refer to indigenous first people as Native Americans, that just subjugates them to the sovereign condition of the state. They indicate that these individuals are Americans. They were just here, before the rest of us created America. But that doesn't make a lot of sense. What they're doing is they're defining a strict relationship between how individual people, indigenous people ought to exist in relation to the state. The visa point is that this turns their indigenous autonomy arguments, because whenever we relegate these individuals as being part of the United States as opposed to their own nations that existed prior to the creation of the United States, and they're never actually going to be able to develop any form of their own sovereignty or autonomy. And the CISA point is that this turns the entirety of the case, because they're always going to be relegating people to a strict relationship with the state as opposed to their own self-determination.
Alright, y'all ready for class?
Can you repeat the alt text?
Oh yeah, I need to copy the alt text as well as conditionality of it.
As well as what?
The steps.
It's conditional.
Sweet.
I'll take a copy. Do y'all have it?
Yeah, I need to blank sheet of paper.
Do you have any other questions?
Anything. you repeat your third solvency point? The permanent is the worst form of paranoid exceptionalism, right? Is that
Right, yeah.
Oh, I just want to make sure I got the tag right. Okay. We're gonna go case solvency. Actually, I'm gonna put advantage 1, advantage 2 on top first, and then talk about solvency. And then we decay in the order of alt solvency framework down from there. Does that make sense? So I just put the alt and solvency on top.
All solvency framework.
Yeah. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. Alright. Anyone not ready? Cool. My first argument in Advantage 1 is that you're going to be sending across the entirety of Advantage 1. They don't talk about specifically our court case of Allen v. What was it? Allen v.
The
State Board of Elections ruling, and talk about specifically how it's going to be hurting people, how the current status quo is only hurting minority individuals in the country, as well as the impacts here, which would talk about how it resolve some of the disenfranchisement that currently exists. But initially, you're going to be sending most of the Advantage 2 talking about brinksmanship specific to forests and how the National Forest Service currently has a lack of employees, and it's hard to maintain this if we have the political gridlock that's happening now. That's what I want to go with. Solvency. Alright, this is going to be a little while. The first argument is that the ethics become impossible in a capitalist frameset, but however the alternative doesn't resolve the capitalist frameset, it only accepts whatever being this does not resolve into the capitalist mindset, which probably an indication that the affirmative becomes a trigraph for the term to the next argument that by info redistricting how populations react to the state, but additionally, our argument is that this particular will only take the info of populations and won't take into account any Democrat or Republican split or any kind of actual demographic in the area. Really, what it's doing is literal body counts. So this is the exact way in which whatever being exists and just quantifying people, like literally just taking a group, like,
I'm sorry,
you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying, Evelyn?
I don't.
She is no one, scratch it, fuck it.
Okay.
No one gets what I'm saying, makes sense in my head, but probably doesn't. Next argument is that they talk about how the absence of political foresight. Do you have anything?
No, I scrapped that argument.
Yes.
Oh, cool, I missed it then. Sorry. The next argument is that they talk about the term fantasy. Fantasy is solvency, but my first argument is that debate is an intrinsic act of fantasy. We always act in a fantasy world, is probably an indication that the entirety activity debate is the fantasy in which they talk about, but additionally this is relevant to them as well, which means that the term relates to the K as well, because they are also acting within the fantasy, which will block in the same violence that they talk about, but additionally they talk about there's no solvency for the athletes. They said we can't stay neutral for long. However, Iowa disproves this. They have a specific nonpartisan committee that does this exact thing that the affirmative plan does currently. It has remained nonpartisan for 15 plus years, which is probably an indication that we can have a neutral party do this. Minority turn. They say plan removes the districts that are already created, but my first argument is that the districts that are already created are fucked up. That's why we need to change the ethic of this district that's already happening, and that's why the NCAI is good here. What's up? Cool. The next argument that they talk about is Shelby County Beholder decision, but they misinterpret what the Shelby County Beholder decision actually does. It removes the federal districts from being able to be made. Basically, they took out the actual numbers that are being put in place in the 1965 Federal Rights Act. Was it 63? I think it's 63. But the first argument here is that they took out basically the numbers that were put in place there. Basically, okay. The decision made it so that they recommended that Congress make a federal districting guide post Shelby County Beholder, which is an indication that the affirmative is the call to action that Shelby County already does. But additionally, they made it so they didn't make it so the states just do whatever they want. They removed the federal districting commission that was already in place, which is why the states do whatever they want now. Their recommendation is that we put it back into place through whatever we do, and the affirmative plan does this. The next argument is that they talk about Indian rhetoric. However, they talk about how it's the colonial language and the rest of the colonial history, but my first argument is that this is an organization this is how they define themselves in this organization, with probably an indication that it's not going to be a rhetoric turn here, but additionally that there's no eternal impact here, but additionally they talk about Native Americans turn, referring to anyone as a Native American in this particular will lead to eternal indigenous autonomy and as well as the relationship to these particular words. My first argument here is that I am a white male and I have no idea how to address another individual if I'm trying to refer to a group of individuals. We refer to this particular group as the National Commission for American Indians because that is how they have self-identified and put themselves out in the world.
And the language that they use in their entire website.
And the language that is used on the entirety of the website and the group itself was probably an indication that we're probably in the clear here, but there's no real turn here.
Whatever they need to do.
And we're letting them do basically be the whatever being that they want because we're giving them the complete autonomy to choose for all. On the all, first, perm, do the plan in all non-mutually exclusive parts of the all. Do the plan in all non-mutually exclusive parts of the all. My first argument is that Gary Williamson in Epistemic and Pragmatic Action talks about Tetris players and specifically how they use tetrameters in order to evaluate pragmatic and epistemic action at the same time. His argument is specific that you can evaluate the critical arguments at the same time as well as do a pragmatic action at the same time, which probably indication that an affirmative plan text or a policy action probably is a key to actually being the quote of whatever being. The second argument is the Trojan horse. We need to work within a political system to actually change the political system by being whatever being within a political system. This makes it so that the affirmative is a key turning point. There's a key solvency point for the alternative to ever exists. But the next argument is the dogmatism. Our argument is here is that in second wave feminism, the black body was always pushed out of the movement because of the fact that they had different ideas than the white majority, which is probably an indication that we need to be able to actually synthesize our ideas together, or else this only pushes us to the outside, which leads me to my next argument, which is coalition today. Without accepting us into your movement, this only makes it so that we are pushed out of your whatever being movement and pushed into the already box categories. They're problematic because this only leads to a terminal collapse of from the alternative forever even happening, but an additional argument against the entirety of the criticism by basically pushing us out. By rejecting permutations, you push us out, right? They're talking about how the perm is the worst form of paranoid exceptionalism. My argument is that the perm is the best form of synthesizing ideas to actually talk about the things that are the problem in the status quo. What's up?
Oh, and the fact is, like, the all isn't able to break down the compartmentalizations. However, we're able to open up the avenue and break down the carpet.
The app can't break down the compartmental. I can't say it either. That already happens in the status quo. The affirmative is the only way that we can actually break down the problems in the status quo and make it so that we can actually make a change toward the whatever being.
You're
But
the policy
additionally,
interpretation of this.
yeah, we're the policy interpretation of the alternative. But the next argument they talk about is bare life. Basically, they prefer not to engage. However, the affirmative is the ultimate non-engagement because the fact that we're basically taking a political system and basically rejecting all the current ways in which we do it. The next argument is that the alternative is the only way to solve the AF. This is simply not true because they can't solve all of the problems of the AF by being by endorsing whatever being. They can't solve redistricting commissions by doing that. It's just simple a tagline that has no warrant to it. On the framework, counter-roll the ballot. The judge should evaluate through a policy net benefit lens. The judge should evaluate through a policy net benefit lens. What this means is that you should evaluate the impacts of the criticism versus that of the case, specifically our ontological impacts and versus the criticism ontological impacts, and evaluate where they come into play on each other. You get it? They talk about debate as a question of values, and we argue we have pretty good values here. We're taking away the current political system, which we say disenfranchises thousands, if not millions of people in the United States, and we make it so that they have a voice not only in our government systems, but outside. What?
Our PMC is the PMC
Our
is
PMC
our
is our performance?
ontological interrogation.
The PMC is a performative ontological interrogation of the current power structure that they talk about. When we go to the links level, they talk about how the rights is contingent on state participation. My first argument is a term that state participation is going to be uniquely good in this sense because if we just say we're not going to be a part of the state anymore, this only leads to complete political
Apathy.
Thank you. Political apathy in which the state doesn't break down, but rather it rejects these people from the state itself, which is probably the reason why you're going to be preferring my Trojan horse argument. But additionally, they talk about inclusion, including populations, as what it is and what is not acceptable. My first argument against this is that we're basically making it right now. That is the status quo. This is a link describing the status quo, and we change that and ontologically take it away. They talk about threats to construction justified state of emergency. Our argument is that we're not currently in a state of emergency, but rather we are basically solving for a lot of the problems that we can see. Right. The fourth is the method fluidity of legality. This is exactly this. Legality is the reason why Native American populations were already pushed out of the political sphere, which is probably a reason why we turned that as well.
Hey.
I like it.
Alright, starting. It'll be the criticism in the, I guess, the same order of the MG. So alternative, framework, links, and then the impacts. Then the case arguments. By that I mean the solvency arguments that make sense in the C, and then the advantages.
Can you just sign this so I make sure I know where you're doing?
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Excited.
Where's the Is anyone not ready? The entire problem with the project of the affirmative, is that it assumes that one can only have rights if they constrict themselves and define themselves in relation to the sovereign. This is why their permutation doesn't work. This is why their link terms do not work, because they only allow the first peoples to identify themselves if they identify themselves in relation to and participation with neoliberal democracy. This is why the affirmative loses this debate. To the alternative, line by line, they say permanent the planet and all non-mutually exclusive parts of the alternative. There are a couple of disadvantages to this. The first is particularism, that you are not able to solve any problem until you solve every problem. Their insistence that we only focus on one particular manifestation of inequality within liberal democracy locks them into that one criticism of democracy. Then, which means that whenever we fix that one problem, we begin to believe that the system is now benevolent and self-correcting, which means we stop fighting against the inequalities that democracy inevitably creates. Which means that the permutation only results in the long-term entrenchment of the inequality that they say is so problematic in advantage one. The second disadvantage is that of exception. That you can cross by the you can extend the number 3 solvency argument on the alternative that indicates that the permutation is the worst form of paranoid exceptionalism. That they define a unique exception where it is okay to endorse whatever being, except for this particular place where we think that first people should be allowed to define congressional districts. This is the exception that we talk about. This is why the permutation never works. The impact of that is the impact of the criticism, the ways in which that this creates acceptable and unacceptable forms of life that reduces all life to that of bare existence. Now they say that pragmatic action is critical and that we can evaluate critical theory and pragmatism, but our argument is that whatever being does not want to be defined by pragmatic action. Whatever being is in opposition to sovereign existence, which means that whatever existence is ontologically different than whatever they are thinking it is, which means that it is worthy of consideration alone, not with any sort of conclusion of the affirmative. Next argument the MG makes is that we can work within a political system. But you can cross by the argument I just made that whatever being is uniquely opposed to that existence within a political system. That whatever being is designed to be ontologically different and categorically strange to that of the sovereign, so that the sovereign does not have a way to understand whatever being is. You can extend the number 1 solvency argument, which indicates that whatever being is life that cannot be referred to by the government, which means that it has a unique incentive to avoid that mapping that the MG thinks is so important. For example, their next argument they make that we need to synthesize ideas is problematic for the existence of whatever being, because whatever being refuses to be mapped, which means that whenever we do engage in that type of resistance against any sort of acts of sovereignty, that we give the sovereign the exact blueprints to what any sort of resistance would look like, which means that any sort of revolution, any sort of resistance is ultimately taken away by the sovereign, because we've given them the keys to our movement, which means that there's no way that the permutation is ever able to solve. Furthermore, they have conceded that whatever being in its inherent opposition to the sovereign is a unique reason why it is able to solve the affirmative, because it is a way in which we ontologically negate the sovereign, the way in which we consider ourselves to be outside of what the sovereign has their jurisdiction over, which means we solve all of these arguments about voter disenfranchisement. The next argument that the MG makes is that the permutation allows for synthesis. I've answered this above. They say that the affirmative breaks down problems, and it's not about the breaking down of problems so the sovereign can understand what we're doing. It's about defining ourselves as ontologically different than the sovereign, so that we cannot have that mapping occur. They also say that the affirmative is the ultimate form of non-engagement, which I do not understand how that makes any sense, because they're literally conditioning First People's involvement with the sovereign off of their participation with voting and democracy, which means that they only allow those first peoples to be an acceptable form of life if they redistrict our congressional districts for us, which I think is a pretty privileged and problematic way to view those individuals. Now they say that we aren't able to solve the affirmative. I made that argument above. We certainly do. Yes, the framework.
Do you do coalitions sometimes?
Oh yeah, sorry. They say that we push out coalitions. Our couple of responses. The first is that this is not about coalition building. It's about ontologically positioning the subject in reference to the sovereign, which means that whatever being and its refusal to be defined by sovereign definition is uniquely creates a unique disadvantage for any sort of coalition building. The second argument, though, is that this is the logic that would result in us not calling out white supremacists because we don't want to destroy black-white alliances, which means that there is no unique reason why the coalition building that they talk about is preferable. Now to the framework. Their counter-role of balance is to evaluate the debate through policy and a benefit lens, but the problem with this is that this means that we only ever look at the debate through the effects and ability to sustain sovereignty. The impacts that they identify is democracy and voter enfranchisement, which is critical to maintenance of sovereignty, and their second advantage is forest fires, which means that both of their advantages are leaning towards ideas that maintain sovereign legitimacy, which means that this is a unique reason why the permutation doesn't solve, but it's also a unique reason why their role of the ballot makes no sense. It makes much more sense and is the appropriate question to use the role of the ballot from 1 and C, which is to interrogate the ontological foundations of sovereign power. Only through that interrogation of ontological status can we understand how we ought to relate to sovereignty, which means that the criticism is the only lens that is the only advocacy that actually makes sense in the context of this debate. They also say that they have values and that the PMC is does ontologically interrogate, but no, they beg the question. They do not ask why we ontologically involve ourselves with the sovereign. They ask how can we make ourselves better for the sovereign. This is the unique difference between the alternative and the affirmative, which means that the alternative is the only side that accurately and effectively interrogates that relationship to the links. The engineer one is that they say that state participation is good because otherwise it leads it's key to individual agency, but our argument is not about individual agency. It's about the ability for the individual and the subject to define themselves as categorically different than sovereign, which means that there is no risk of any sort of office that the PMR can go for this rights argument. What I do want is the number 2 and 3 links. The number 2 link is that the number 2 and 4. The number 2 link is that the affirmative creates boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable forms of life via their use of inclusive exclusion. The warrant that Nick gives is that the first peoples were formerly, according to the affirmative, not considered as part of the sovereign, but now suddenly they are in this. Now suddenly they are because they are being allowed to redraw district lines, which means that at one time they were not an acceptable form of life, and now they suddenly are, which is what creates that distinction in the first place. In terms, the entirety of the affirmative now, the number 4 link, which is the affirmative represents a method of fluid legality, which allows the sovereign to create a state of exception. The warrant that Nick gives is the Black Panthers taking over the Capitol building in Sacramento. The only answer that they give is that this is a reason why individuals are pushed out, but that's not responsive to the thesis of the LOC, which indicates that the affirmative is literally grants the ability of the sovereign to make a sovereign decision, and then whenever the sovereign realizes that the decision is unpopular, they can then reverse that decision to incorporate more individuals into that status of sovereign, which means that they only ever incorporate those individuals by their relationship to the sovereign, to the impacts. I want the root cause argument and the endless atrocities argument. These are both, actually, just extend all three. These are all indicative that whenever the affirmative engages in this type of conscription of the self to the sovereign, it means that the affirmative becomes inevitable, turns 100% of the impacts, and guarantees error replication that the affirmative is not able to solve. Now to the solvency arguments. I want the ideology turn because that's all I really need. He says that the alternative is not able to resolve issues of ethics, but I think that in a world where we are engaging in whatever being means that we have a unique method of escaping the ways that capital has ideologically constructed our reality and our everydayness, because it literally is a withdrawal from that system, which means we are a unique reason why we solve ethics in the affirmative is just insolvent.
So the LOR order is going to be the alt of the K, the impacts of the K, and then the ideology term.
All impacts by?
The alt impacts and then the ideology term, so the first term on solvency.
Sweet.
Is anyone not ready? UT Tyler HJ win this debate around for two compelling reasons. The first is that the alt solves the entirety of the criticism, the affirmative, and they don't have access to a permutation. But the second reason is that the criticism outweighs and turns the entirety of the affirmative. A lot of this analysis was done by Carver and Nemo, but I'm going to do a little bit more of impact weighing here just to make this very, very clear. On the alternative page, the first argument I want is that the alternative solves the entirety of the criticism. The only argument that the MG makes on alternative solvency is that you don't use the state, which means that you can't solve, and there are some other like re-articulations of that. However, this analysis is pretty problematic considering the entire criticism is an indictment to the idea of political participation being good. We indicate that the only way to actually solve back for the categorization and violent managerialism that is sovereignty's control over life is to embrace whatever being. The alternative is the only way to actually solve back for the categorization of life because those who embrace whatever being refuse to be categorized and defined by the state, meaning that their ontological position is not defined nor restricted by what the sovereign imposes on them as being acceptable or unacceptable. The second argument, though, is that the alt solves the entirety of the affirmative. All of the problems in the affirmative are problems that stem from either one, the lack of political participation, or the problems that happen whenever people participate in politics. So I think that the alternative solves 100% of the affirmative because whenever people don't concern themselves with their ability to influence the decision of the sovereigns, but rather just focus on their own ontological identity and growth, that probably means that it doesn't matter whenever they don't have districts that properly represent them anymore because they're living a more fulfilling life that isn't restricted by the inability for the sovereign to actually represent people. But the third argument on the alternative is they absolutely have no chance of getting a perm because of a few reasons. The first two are the disads that Carver articulates in the MO, particularism and exception. These are both of these come from extended analysis coming out of the LOC. These are embedded link arguments that are also reasons why they don't get a permutation because it wouldn't solve, but it also actively turns the app. But the third reason is that they just don't do enough link analysis coming out of the MG as to why they don't link, other than saying that state participation is good. We improved state participation, and legality is a reason that the Native Americans were pushed out. None of these are reasons why they don't link to the criticism. I think the LOC's articulations of what the links are and why the affirmative does that is pretty clear, and Carver's extensions of these in the MO are very clean. So there's no chance that the affirmative resolves the criticism, and there's every chance that the alt solves the app. But now to some impact weighing. First, impacts 1 and 2 from the criticism are literally, we articulate this as endless atrocities and violence. That is objectively worse than your vote not mattering or some trees getting set on fire. I think it's pretty simple. The magnitude here is on the negative side. But, more importantly, the second argument I want in regards to this impact weighing is that the criticism is an impact turn to the entirety of the affirmative. The thesis of the criticism is not well enough responded to, and they only have blippy articulations about why state participation is good because we can make the state better. That seems like, one, a link to the criticism, but also a reason why the entire affirmative is a bad idea. Lastly, though, the third impact module coming out of the criticism is a turn to the affirmative. Whenever they can see the entire impact module, specifically impact number 3, indicating that their ontological assumptions in regards to the state leads to endless error replication, meaning that they never have the capacity to solve. That means there's a 0% probability because every time they try to take a policy that will increase the standard of living of people, they are operating on false ontological assumptions of sovereignty, which means that they don't have the ability to do anything. The last argument I want, though, is Carver's analysis on the ideology around solvency. This independently turns the entirety of the affirmative for a distinct reason from the criticism, and that is whenever they operate within the ideology of neoliberal capitalism, this is just a reinterpretation of the LOC arguments, but they don't have the ability to properly ethically deliberate. Their only argument is that the alt doesn't resolve this, but I don't think that's responsive to the idea that if they can't actually determine that their app is a desirable idea, then you default negative. This is how debate works. So at the end of the day, we outweigh turn, and I don't see compelling reason to go to the
Starting plus prep?
Yeah.
our solvency sheet, advantage 1, advantage 2 quickly, and then the framework links impacts. Embracing whatever being self does not check back for the fact that there are people disenfranchised in the status quo. It does not break down the sovereign. The only way for us to be able to break it down is through the perm. You're going to be extending on the perm because one, particularly you're going to be extending on Daniel's analysis about the Trojan horse, how this is going to be important for us to be able to work within the system in order to be able to rectify the problems that we see that occurs within the sovereign. This is always going to be preferable because it allows us to be able to allow us to have political action in order to be able to alleviate the problems as we see within the sovereign. We recognize that the sovereign has several issues. However, the affirmative plan text is the only way to be able to at least rectify the problems that are existing within those power structures, like pragmatically, while also thinking about the criticism, which is always going to be preferable because this allows us to be able to break down, be able to function within both, which is always going to be important. Look. Like, the alt doesn't collapse the sovereign. It's just like ignores the sovereign completely. It doesn't ignore the realities that, guess what? There's still going to be districting. Guess what? Native Americans are still going to be disenfranchised. And other people as well are going to be disenfranchised as a result of our political actions. However, the only way for us to be able to rectify those issues is for us to be able to take some form of political action, which is always going to be preferable because one, it gives you the most probable impact, because when we fix these policy solutions, it's not creating like a mask or any sort of exceptionalism or like looking towards their particulars. It allows us to be able to at least make those certain strides to be able to fix out instead of standing in our ivory tower all day and saying let's embrace whatever being. It's not going to change the fact that there are people who do not have any sort of representation, which is always going to be preferable in the affirmative world rather than looking at this through the lens of the alternative. Moving on to the solvency. Look. This is like one of the very first steps to be able to break down the mindset that has already been created. The fact is, particularly within our whole case, like the advantages, articulate all the uniquenesses, articulate right now how the system is fucked up, how the sovereign is fucked up, and we give you reasons as to why. Like if we're able to at least better it, it's always going to be preferable. If we're able to work within the system, this allows us to be able to give back people to at least give them some form of autonomy, to be able to allow them to be able to have any sort of voice instead of having their voices shut down. Guess what? The alternative isn't going to change the fact that people still get their voices, their silence in the status quo. People don't get the representation that they need, particularly with Native American tribes, where they don't have any sort of representations. They don't have any people representing them in their state Congress. The world is still going to exist. Like whether or not we embrace the being, the fact is, it's like. The sovereign is still going to exist. The affirmative plan is the only way to be able to pragmatically be able to break those down. If we're looking at the ontology and stuff, ontology isn't going to change the fact that people still don't have any sort of political participation within the system, meaning that we're able to outweigh them on this question. Moving on to the framework. Looking at the role of policy net benefits allows us to be able to move away from the ivory tower of scholars and to be able to function within the sphere in order for us to be able to make any sort of problems. When we come into the space, they say, well, all we talk about is like high up on the yeah.
Your one for that is Occupy Wall Street. They moved away from the little ivory tower to the actual policy change.
Yeah, like Occupy Wall Street, they moved away from the political, as well as the Tea Party, they moved away from the political ivory tower and allowed them to engage in political action, which is going to be necessary, particularly when we say our PMC is ontological performance of what we see as what's being wrong with the sovereign, and our attempts to at least try to alleviate it more. Moreover, onto the link, the link arguments they said we link hard because we have state, we're relying on the sovereign. However, okay, fine. We link into this criticism. However, the thing is yes, there is a sovereign, but the alternative does not break it down, which is going to be very important. By embracing whatever being, it's still not going to break down the fact that there are still these governmental structures that are in place. Like I can endorse myself as whatever being, but it's not going to change the fact that I have to. I'm still operating within the governmental system. It's not even then. These are just explanations of the status quo we're trying to break down. Moving on to the impacts. Look, like the impacts. The root cause of violence, by not embracing whatever being apparently has these issues, but with our perm is able to at least protect us from these impacts, allow us to be able to move past beyond this, and to be able to at least have the sort of political actions that are necessary for us to be able to move away from violence and to move away from ignoring populations, and to like when we operate in a system that already has rights, acknowledging that people should have rights is a first step for this.
Good round. Never mind, you before. What's your name? I'm Nick. Nick, nice to meet you. What's your name? Daniel, sorry. Daniel, okay.
Take how time in the restroom?
Sure, I'll be done pretty quick.
Okay, I'll.
So in this round, I ended up going with the negative. A couple of reasons for that. I think you all want to structure a case with either larger impacts or some sort of explicit framing device to exclude impacts that are high in magnitude. Just from an objective position, right, at the end of the round, even if y'all win like the entirety of your case, there's some stuff about forest fires, and I'm not even sure how big these forest fires are gonna be, or like property, there will be some forest fires probably, and like people will get to vote more. And I also am not 100% clear on the impact to that.
Yeah.
It's sort of circular in that sense. And just from that perspective, I think that if the negative wins very much of a risk of their criticism alternative, there would be no reason for me to ever risk a permutation in that sense. And so I think you need some bigger stuff just sort of right off the bat. I also think that you all probably want to refine your strategy a little bit. You're going for this permutation link turn strategy, which is often a really effective method against a case. But if you're going to go for that strategy, I don't think that the net benefits debate really gets you anything unless you're like going hard for it. And you don't really go hard for it. It's like 15 to 30 seconds in any given speech. You'd have to like really go all in on that discussion to be able to get something there. And a criticism like this is sort of going to have responses to that framework kind of argument, and so that might be a little difficult. I think you need, like some sort of instrumental defense of sovereign power in some sense, and sort of debunking some of the claims that they're making. Because, yeah. I think the permutation, coming out of the PMR, I don't really have a direct answer to any of the two disads to the permutation, though I do think there's a risk that these two disads contradict with each other to some extent. The particular, I think that it would be easy to cast your alternative as a form of particularism, absent some sort of deeper explanation on what precisely you mean by particularism. And in that sense, I think that that sort of creates these state of exception. That's, I don't know, that's a thing that I was thinking about. I really like the explanation of whatever being that you offer during the MO. I think that it's particularly clear, and I also think that it results in answering your permutation in as far as it casts the alternative as nothing being non-mutually exclusive. This long explanation that we have that is offered of whatever being is basically an argument why everything in the alternative is mutually exclusive. If you all want to go for this, you should be identifying the pieces of the alternative that you think are not mutually exclusive, and then explaining how you access them. I think that that might give you a little bit of inroads on that. I think that for your PMR, it would be a good strategy to select specific arguments out of the MO to extend and respond to their claims on. You're just sort of narrating through, which can be an effective strategy depending on what you're going for, but I think that in a more technical debate, you want to identify what argument you're trying to go for, extend that, and then answer their specific counter warrants. For instance, I think you could probably use this dogmatism argument that gets made in your shell as a disad of some kind to the alternative, and at least cast that as a reason why the alternative by itself might be problematic. Yeah, it just gives you a little bit more. And that's about identifying MG arguments, extending them, and going for them. I thought you all had a really coherent and clear explanation of Agamben, so thank you for rocking. Any questions?
Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Hey,
Yeah.
hey, good luck. Bye.
Thanks. You too.